Thank you all for joining us for the Introduction to Research Writing for STEM workshop. Joining us today is Dr. Jason Steffen, Associate Professor of Physics and Astronomy. In this workshop, we're going to learn about setting goals, effectively structuring scientific papers, and honing in on clear and concise writing style necessary for successful STEM research communication. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to our speaker to get us started.
All right, thank you. I appreciate it. So welcome, everybody. Most of the stuff I'm going to be talking about are kind of tips that can help you as you try to take some idea and put it into scientific writing form. It comes from my experience. There are a number of, I can understand hearing arguments against what I'm going to show, but I do have a fair amount of publications under my belt. I should hit 100 by the end of the year, which is a reasonable amount in my discipline. And most of those papers, I was the second to last person to touch them. That a lot of times they would get written and then they would come to me and then I would clean up everything and then it would go to the lead author who would then submit the paper. So a lot of this work, or a lot of what I'll show you, has basically been learned through mistakes that I've made over the last several decades, and hopefully this will be of use to you. So I'm going to give some initial thoughts and then focus on the structure of the paper, how to write it, like what order I do things in when I write it, or when I should say that now I tell my graduate students how to write them, because most of my papers that I've written since coming here have been written by my graduate students, because I think that's part of the learning process, is to write your own papers. And then I'll do lots of corrections. We go through several drafts before it finally gets submitted. But in general, when I work with my graduate students, I don't make corrections on their writing. I tell them, like, here's what needs to change, and then I have them do the corrections, because that was what happened with me when I was a graduate student, and it was one of the most beneficial lessons that I learned. And I'll talk a bit about prose and how to make your prose such that someone will want to read it, because academic writing isn't always the most interesting writing to read, and there are reasons for that hopefully you can avoid. Some of this may be discipline specific. There may be certain journals that you'd be submitting to that have certain editorial policies, but if they're different than the ones that I show you, then they're probably wrong. And then I'll give you some information about, like, just some tips about the writing process itself that I use for me when I'm writing something especially something that I don't really want to write. One of the first things to know is, who is your audience? Who is it that you're writing to? Are you writing for professionals that are in the same field? Are you writing for professionals that are in other fields? Are you writing for the public? Because these require a different type of approach. So for example, if you're writing just a regular research article to professionals in your field, there's a certain amount of vocabulary that they're already going to understand. If, on the other hand, you're writing to science or nature, or in many cases, the letters version of a given journal will be primarily geared towards a general audience. So it might be physicists, but it would be all physicists and not just physicists in some particular area. And so if you have a more general audience of professionals, that will also change your vocabulary a little bit, and the order that you present things, and what you define, what you choose to define, and what you choose to leave as prior knowledge. So knowing who you're writing to can help direct the type of language that you use in your papers. And then also knowing what your message is. What is it that you're trying to report on? And what are the most important takeaway items that you get from it? Because having a coherent message will make it so that the reader will get from your paper what it is that you want them to get from it. If you have a message that's kind of muddled, then the reader won't necessarily come away knowing what they were supposed to get from it, or they may come away with a completely different interpretation of what the paper was about than what you intended. One of the things that will help with that is knowing what the scope of your paper is. So it's really easy in any discipline to have the scope of the paper expand and creep outwards and start encompassing more and more tangents and sub-analyses and conclude, like you have a result and then that implies something else and that implies something else. And if you're not careful, if you don't exercise sufficient self-control, you can end up with a paper that's gigantic that nobody wants to read and certainly nobody wants to review. But also one that it's hard to know. It will miss out on its impact in the literature, in my opinion, because it will be known for a few things that might not be all that your paper has to show. So I'll give you an example. So one of these things that I get, a question that I ask whenever I'm writing a paper is, at what point is a tangent to the main line of the paper worth spinning off and turning into its own paper, as opposed to just leaving it as a section within a paper? So if you have a tangent that you go off, like this inspired me to study this new idea, then if that new idea starts to get very large, then it's probably best to just spin it off and have it as a subsequent paper rather than the one that you're currently working on. Okay, so my general approach, and this is not something that's widely accepted in my discipline, but it's one that I think should be more widely accepted within my discipline, because there are a lot of times where the paper has multiple messages and it lacks the impact that it could have if it was more focused. So my approach with my students is, you have one paper, you have one message that you're going to deliver with that paper. So I'll give you an example of where I learned this. Was a paper that I wrote about almost a decade ago, not quite a decade ago, on the period ratio distribution of Kepler's multi-planet systems, candidate multi-planet systems. It was kind of long. It's one of the longer papers that I've written. It has 76 citations, which is not bad in this discipline, especially since it's kind of a narrow topic. And it had two primary ideas in it. The one on the left was the period ratio distribution that we measured from the Kepler planets. And the one on the right is looking at a bunch of systems that are close to a particular type of orbital configuration that is interesting to dynamicists. So it had two main results. Everybody knows about the first result and nobody knows about the second result. And it would have been better had we just forked this paper into two and had one of them about the period ratio distribution and a second one about the proximity to resonance, because the scope just kind of got out of control. We packaged it in one paper, we sent it out, and half the message was lost because we didn't just divide it into two papers and submit two separate papers. And so it could have had, I mean, we're using citations as an indication that it's of interest to people in the discipline. I think there would be more citations to the sum of the two papers if people actually knew that the second half of the paper existed. But it was lost because the bulk of the paper was on the period ratio distribution. And so this is basically just sitting, I think, in relative anonymity. Another thing, this is an example of a place where it was more successful. Partway through me writing the paper on the left, this Kepler's missing planets, I noticed a discrepancy and I started looking at it in more detail. And that eventually spawned to make a second paper. And this second paper was actually more interesting than the first one, in my opinion. But it was because we were writing one paper, well, in this case, I was writing one paper. I saw something interesting in it and spawned a new study that I'm still working on it now. I have a graduate student who's currently working on a revision of this paper, the second paper, that came from, oh, there's something interesting that came out of this study or this analysis, and this would be a good place to divide it off and have a separate paper about it. A place where this did not happen, and where I saw an interesting result and then didn't follow up on it, was in this paper that I wrote in 2016. Is we saw this distribution. So this is a blob that shows basically where these different planets are. And it looked like it was bimodal. It looked like it had two different peaks. In fact, it shows that it has two different peaks. And I tried for about a week to come up with some measurement of the statistical significance of these two different peaks, and decided that I wasn't able to do it in the time frame that I had available to me to wrap it up, because I was moving. And so I just dropped that analysis, removed a paragraph of text, and then a year later, so that was a mistake on my part, if for no other reason than the fact that you don't know necessarily what's going to take off and what's going to be interesting. So I saw something interesting, I started working on it, I wasn't able to complete it, and so I just completely dropped it. About a year later, there was that same peak was found in a different study that now has almost 1,000 citations to it. And so fortunately, I mean, these are people that I work with a lot, so I'm happy for them that they were able to pick up where I failed to complete what I was working on. But had they not done this study, eventually it would have come out, but it would have set I think the industry or like the discipline behind, because there was something interesting that was there. I saw it, I started working on it, I put it aside, and it would have been better to have an extra year of work on the subject rather than having to wait for someone else to pick up where I had dropped the ball. Fortunately, the group from California didn't drop the ball, and they came out with that study, and it's actually been a pretty significant line of inquiry in my discipline. So if you see something that's interesting in your study, you may want to fork your study and then publish a separate paper on those interesting results. Or another thing that could happen is that you may want to just rewrite your paper around that second topic rather than the first. So I have an example of that here. So this was a paper that we had been working on, me and a former graduate student. So he was an undergraduate at the time that we were doing this, and he just graduated this last spring. We had been working on it for about 4 years throughout his undergraduate career. And right when we were about to submit, the paper seemed to be lacking a little bit of direction. Right when we were about to submit, he produced the figure that is all the blue dots on this screen. And it was like, there's nothing, there's nothing, there's nothing. And then something turns on all of a sudden. And as soon as we saw that picture, it's like, this is what the paper needs to be about. And so we completely rewrote the paper. It took us another year basically to get it out, because we completely rewrote the paper with this graph, as it was far more interesting than any of the other graphs that we had produced up to that point. And so that just, the moral of the story being, when you're writing these papers, look for things that are interesting and follow up on those things that are interesting. When you do that, sometimes it might mean that some of the work that you've done doesn't actually make it, doesn't actually see the light of day. So just sometimes a pet project of yours might not be worth it if the data lead you in some other direction. So I guess what I have for this is that your research article is not a memoir. So it's not about you outlining your struggles with coming to grips with the observations that you made and the data that you took and how you analyzed it and what mistakes there were. The historical timeline of your work probably doesn't matter. And what matters is you have a message to deliver, and you want to deliver it in a very clear and precise way. You don't necessarily want to go through all the twists and turns that got you to your endpoint, because most people aren't necessarily going to be interested in the twists and turns that shaped your life. So if you want to write a memoir about your scientific career, then that would be the place to put it in. Okay, so in my discipline, and almost all the papers that I've written over the last 20 years or so have had a structure where it's basically just an abstract and introduction, the data or methods section, the results and analysis section, and then a discussion section and a conclusion section. These are not the same thing. They have different reasons for having them. And with an appendix sometimes at the end. Not everything has an appendix. And each of these portions of the paper has a unique role to play in the literature, not only in the paper, but in the literature itself. And so I think it's useful to have in mind when you're writing a paper, even if you don't have exactly these same sections, what order do I present things and what information about my study goes in which portion? Some disciplines may have the methods section later or earlier. Well, okay, earlier is kind of hard to do, but might have them in slightly different order. But there's a reason to have each section, and those reasons don't overlap very much. You want to have each section to be kind of self-contained, in my opinion, because it makes it so that someone who's reading your paper knows where to go if they want to find the answer to a particular question. They don't have to reread 15 pages of text, most of which is boring and not related to what it is they're looking for. And so by separating out like what information goes into what place, you can save your readers a bunch of time where they can read the portions of the paper that they care about the most. So the abstract, my abstracts are usually pretty short because I figure that a long abstract nobody is going to read, and it should just include what are the what is a sentence of motivation for the paper, and then what are the main results that come from it, because this is your opportunity to get someone to open up the rest of the paper and to look at it. So really long-winded abstracts, my eyes glaze over. As soon as I see that it's 2 paragraphs or even a long paragraph that's the majority of a page, I'll skip the abstract and I'll just start flipping through the figures to see what the figures show. And so if you want the text to be read that you spent on, I try to keep the abstract as short as possible. I mean, you can only go so far, but try to keep it really short. The introduction is important because it outlines what the gap in the current knowledge is that needs to be filled. In other words, it tells the reader why they should bother reading the paper. So if you don't have, not only why they should bother reading the paper, but also why you were justified in doing the study that you did. So you're outlining, here is all of the knowledge, and you're focusing on, here is the hole in that knowledge that this study is going to fill. And so it motivates everything that has been done, and it motivates the reader as to why they should understand like how your result is going to fit into this tapestry or this puzzle of where the pre-existing knowledge is. So you want to use the introduction as that opportunity to really make the case for why someone should read your paper. In the data and methods section, so this is like when I write my papers, the data and methods section comes next, which is basically what is everything that we did and the technical details of what we did. So like what catalogs we used, what observations we made, how we calibrated the results, what kind of computer software we used, any modifications that we made to it, just outlining basically, here's the lay of the land in our, whether it's in our computer or in the laboratory. Here's the laboratory, here is the equipment. So if it was an experimental result in this portion of the paper, it might have its own section, but in this portion of the paper, it would be a diagram. Here's the experimental apparatus. Here's all the parts that are relevant for, how the data were taken. And also how everything was calibrated. And if it's all compressed or if it's all gathered into this one section, then you don't have to go back and tell other parts of the story later on. You don't have to say, oh, I forgot to mention that we also did this other thing with the apparatus. You can just keep everything kind of self-contained. So what you did, how you gathered your data, and then what you are doing with the data. Then we have a section on results and analysis, which is what we found out, what kind of analysis we did, and what were the overall findings. Like, what is the big figure? What is the money shot that shows here is the most important result that we got from our study? After that, I usually go into, so most of my work is theoretical or data analysis. And so I usually go into how does this apply to different things? So I have some result, and then I say, here is where this result affects things, because it does more than just fill in some gap in the pre-existing literature. It's not like the hole that's in the pre-existing knowledge. The paper that you write doesn't necessarily just fit directly into that hole, but it also might imply things for other areas. And so this is where I would discuss why these results are important, how they affect other disciplines, how they might affect related studies, how it might affect, so I work in extrasolar planets. And so the results that I have in my work might have some relevance to the solar system and how the solar system operates. But I also outline what the limitations are of the study. So for example, if we make some approximation, then this is where I would outline, here is where the approximation would break down. And so additional work that would take that approximation, make it, remove that approximation or change some assumptions that went into the initial study. I outline basically in the discussion section what either what I plan to do or what someone else could do with my work. So if I want to tie off some line of inquiry, then I'll say, you know, these are the things that are still not understood or the limitations of this study, and leave it there so that someone else can pick up on it and maybe do a study of their own that follows on to that work. And then at the very kind of the last major section this is where I ask myself in the conclusions is, if the reader only remembers a few things, what are they? What are the things that they need to take away? It's not a revision, or it's not rewriting the abstract. It's also not rewriting the results section. It's synthesizing everything and making a few statements about, here is how this result, like here is the most important result, or the handful of most important takeaways from this paper, and maybe why they're important, reiterating kind of a collection of the discussion and the results section and the introduction, so that if someone only wants to thumb through the paper, they'll look at the figures and then they'll go to the conclusion section and read that conclusion section, and that should be enough for them in many circumstances to, you know, to claim that they understand what was done in my work. One of the things I didn't put in here is that whenever I have a figure, I try to keep the figure captions completely self-contained, so that if someone is lazy like I am when I read a paper and I only flip to the figures and read the captions, I should be able to understand what I'm looking at and some of the implications of what I'm looking at. So I guess a word of advice is try to make your figure captions so that you don't have to read the text to understand what's in the figure. And then in the appendix is technical details that only one or two other people will ever care about, you know, if they wanted to reproduce some result that you had. So oftentimes, if you have kind of a long calculation that you go through and that's not particularly interesting to everybody, but you want to show that you've done the work, and someone in the future might want to follow along because they want to take it to, you know some new level, then that will go into the appendix. So probably only about half of my papers have appendices, and they usually include not necessarily minor, but technical details that aren't of interest to the audience that I've chosen at the beginning with to write my paper to. One thing that I will point out is that I don't write my papers in this order. Generally speaking, I write my papers in this order, where I say, here's the data that I took, here's the method that I used, and then here's the results, and then the discussion. And then because this is the meat of the paper, and then I go back and write the introduction and the conclusions from there. So I usually write in the order of where can I come up with the most text the most quickly, because if I can come up with a lot of text right away, then I feel like I've accomplished something in my work. So there was a question, does future works go on a discussion or conclusion? Oh, that's a good question. I would have to probably, since I usually leave that up to the student where they want to include that. I usually put it in the discussion section rather than the conclusion section. If I were to do it myself, if I think about things, I would probably put it in the discussion section, but it kind of depends on, you know, what the language is around that point. Because the conclusions, I usually try to narrow the scope just down to what was actually covered in the paper that the reader has in their hand. But that, I don't think it really matters where it goes. I wouldn't necessarily put it in more than one place, because if you put it in too many different places, one, it spreads it out, and two is you repeat yourself, which makes your paper longer, and it makes it a little bit more frustrating to read. So I don't think it really matters. I guess that would, but I would say to leave it in one spot rather than multiple spots. Okay, so moving on from there, what do I have? When you're writing your prose, the way, in my opinion, to think about what you're writing is that the paragraph is your fundamental unit, like one paragraph, one thought. And that you use your paragraphs as the building blocks of the rest of the paper. It's like a paragraph is the equivalent of a word in a sentence. So the letters are the sentences, the word is the paragraph, and then the sentence is the section or the whole paper. So the paragraph is the unit. Have a paragraph about this, have a paragraph about sample selection, have a paragraph about how you might filter something, have a paragraph about this. But the paragraphs are the building block that I have. Let's see. Okay, so I think I answered all those questions. Now, so I recommend that unless it's impossible, to keep your paragraphs short and focused on one single point. Now, one thing that I don't do is I try to avoid having paragraphs that are too short, like single sentences, because that's an indication that you didn't really know what you wanted to write there. And so you just wrote something and you don't know where it belongs. And so it's just stuck there at the end of the section, some one sentence paragraph or one or two sentences. So I generally try to keep my sentences or my paragraphs 3 to 6 sentences long, because as soon as you have a paragraph that takes a full column of the page, nobody wants to read that because, well, okay, maybe there are some people who want to read that. I am not among them. So if I have a paragraph that starts getting too long, I'll look for places to break it apart, just because it takes a long time to get through a paragraph, especially one that's really long. And I get lost in, okay, how does this relate to what happened at the beginning of the paragraph? It becomes a little bit unfocused. And so I usually try to keep my paragraphs tight and short. I think short paragraphs helps readers like myself. I try to write papers that I would want to read. And so short paragraphs help readers like myself get through the paper because they're short goals. I can read the next 5 lines. Okay, that wasn't so bad. I can read the next several lines and see what's going on. It also allows you to continually motivate why the person is reading your paper. So I think I have the next bullet point is provide the motivation for that paragraph up front. So why is somebody reading this paragraph? Which, I mean, that would be basically saying you have a thesis sentence within that paragraph or a topic sentence, so that the reader knows, okay, now I'm reading this paragraph and it's going to contain this piece of information. That also helps them, because if it's a paragraph that they don't really care about, then they can just skip over it if they know upfront what the paragraph is going to be about. So your paper is not only is it not a memoir, but it's also not a murder mystery. And so you don't need to string people along with, I'm going to tell you what this paragraph is about eventually, but in the meantime, I'm going to use my fantastic English skills to show how good of a writer I am. I recommend, like when I'm working with my graduate students, to front load the paragraph. If you have information that you want the reader to get, put it at the front of the paragraph. This is what the paragraph's about, and then they can go get the details a little bit later on. The same thing, I would give the same kind of advice to someone writing a resume. People are going to read down the left-hand side, and you want to make the left-hand side of your resume interesting enough so that they'll read all the way across the page. It can be useful to have historical missteps in the literature, like we tried something and it didn't work, but you generally wouldn't want to put that, in my opinion, at the beginning of the paragraph, all the things that didn't work, because then the person's like, why are you telling me all this stuff that didn't work? So you want to think about, like, where's the best place to put mistakes that you made, or things that you found that you wouldn't repeat if you were to do it over again. That, I think, is something useful to have in the literature. Like, here's a mistake, don't do what I did here. But you want to know where the best place to put that is. And it's definitely, and it might not be a chronology, right? This isn't a history or a timeline. It's a reporting on the result of a research finding. So here's an example. It's a lot of text, but so bear with me as I read through it. So we selected stars from Groovy catalog using funky criteria. We refined our sample with tubular methods. We then analyzed the sample with cool math. Because of esoteric physics, this approach didn't work. So we tried radical criteria and did a hipster analysis. That didn't work either. So we finally selected a sample from gnarly catalog using bodacious criteria. A Mondo analysis of that sample is shown in figure 2. This is almost exactly copied from a paper. Any paper where I'm actually showing the text is one that I'm an author on. This one I stole from somebody else. But what's going on here is they basically said, we tried something, it didn't work. We tried something else, it didn't work either. We tried something else. And what the whole message of the paper is lost by the order that these things were placed, because it was written as a chronology and not as a report of a research finding. So if I were to rewrite this for the author of this paper, I would say we selected a sample of stars from Gnarly Catalog using bodacious criteria. A Mondo analysis of that sample is shown in figure 2. And maybe there'd be another sentence or two in there, but this is the result. Then I would go into, originally we did this thing and it didn't work because of these reasons, and we tried something else and that didn't work either. So that the reader can say, okay, they tried something else to begin with, I'm gonna just skip that paragraph. Or they could say, oh, they tried something else, what did they try? Do I, because I was thinking about doing that and now I don't want to. But rather than having something that's, okay, this isn't interesting, something failed, are they ever gonna get something right? Okay, now the third time's the charm. You put the good stuff up at the front so that people know, so that the reader knows, okay, this is what I've read, this is the analysis, that's the main result that they want me to get from it. Oh, here's some historical information that could be useful for me, or maybe not useful for me, and therefore I know if it's worth it for me to read that paragraph or not. With this first paragraph, you don't know where you're supposed to pay attention in this first paragraph. Is it the first part? No, I don't really need to pay attention to that because it didn't work. And then the second part, I don't need to actually pay attention to that either. So maybe I don't need to pay attention to this whole thing, when in fact, the main result could be the third or fourth sentence in that paragraph. So keep your paragraphs short, put the most important things up at the top so that the reader knows what it is that they're supposed to be getting out of it. Unless otherwise indicated. So unless there's something specifically in your discipline or by an editorial policy of the journal, here are my recommendations. A liberal use of first person. There are first person meaning we, you, me, or I should say we. I have written a paper. I've written a conference proceeding with I. I've written I think one first author paper, maybe two. I'm sorry, one or two single author papers where I used we. I think in one case I was told to switch from I to we. It's a little bit weird. I think people are hesitant to write in I, but oftentimes what I'll do is just bring on a co-author so that I can use we, and then I'll have the co-author write the introduction, and I'll write the rest of the paper. But using first person is useful. One of the main reasons why the use of first person is useful, like we did something, is because it assigns blame, or at least maybe a better way to say that is it assigns responsibility for the thing that's being done. So the analysis shows, or you, the reader, can see something. Although that's not first person, that would be second person, but we see from here. So I guess along with the first person is that it's active voice is, I think, the more important thing. So either first person or third person, but active voice is, I think, important, because the active voice is actually where you assign the responsibility. We saw this, you see this, the analysis shows this, the figure shows this, as opposed to like mistakes were made, where there's no responsibility assigned in those circumstances. So my recommendation, use active voice as much as possible. And use first person, like don't shy away from first person when it makes sense to do so. I think it's important to monitor your use of tense throughout the paper. So most of my papers will use both past tense and present tense, but I use them for different reasons. So if I'm just outlining, here's what we did in this study, here's what the paper shows, here's what the analysis show, I'll use present tense for that. And then I reserve past tense for, if I'm doing a calibration on an instrument, then I'll switch to past tense and say, okay, here's what I did to calibrate my instrument. And then I go back to present tense when I'm describing something. I mean, this is something for you to decide with each of your papers, what tense to use, but you do want to be consistent. Part of the reason I use present tense for most of the writing is because it gives me the option to use past tense for something else, where if you use past tense all the time, then the tone doesn't change if you're switching to a tangent or some background information that you need to outline. So I think it's more flexible to use present tense for the main prose of your paper, and then you can use past tense for other things that aren't central to the discussion. That, again, that's up to you, but for me, that's what I use. I recommend to my students to always use caveman grammar, subject, verb, object. This, like, analysis shows something. We measured voltage, those kinds of things, as opposed to hiding the subject at the end of the sentence and putting a bunch of caveats and things like that up front. You want your prose to be easy to read. The technical portion of your work is probably complicated enough that you don't need to make it worse by having the grammar be confusing to read, hard to parse. You don't want your sentences to be hard to parse. You want your sentences to be really straightforward. I also recommend no adverbs. It's rare that adverbs have any useful technical meaning. And I don't use very many adjectives, and I use very few adverbs in my prose. Now, my recommendation, and this is what I also tell my students and my children, is to follow these rules first, to always use active voice, always use this kind of grammar, whatever. Follow the rules first. Then once you followed them, then you'll know, okay, here's where I can break the rule, and you'll have a reason for breaking them. If you just don't ever follow the rules to begin with, then you don't actually learn the wisdom that's behind them. Whatever wisdom I have to impart, if you don't follow the rules, then you won't have the opportunity to learn the wisdom, and therefore to learn when you can break the rules. Because it is, I use passive voice occasionally. I do use non-caveman grammar occasionally. But in general, when I'm editing my material, I'll go back and I'll put it in this form because in general, it works more often than not to switch to this structure or this kind of grammar. So for example, using a Brown 2000 oscilloscope, the voltage was measured with very high precision. So this would be a pretty common sentence to read in the experimental literature. Using something, we measured this, and with very high precision. This does not sound out of place in the scientific literature, which is part of the reason why the scientific literature is kind of boring to read in many circumstances. This breaks basically all the rules that I outlined. It's got the least important information up front. It's written in the third person. The voltage was measured, some magical way the voltage was measured. And it was measured with very high precision. So you have two adverbs in that sentence. So I guess I would say, who measured the voltage? Did the voltage measure itself? Was it measured by some third party? Who is responsible for mistakes in measuring the voltage? What does high precision even mean? So is high precision, is it 1%? Is it 10%? This happens in many circumstances. I remember in particle physics where people would say light particles or low mass particles, but low mass to some people in the discipline was like 1/1 millionth of mass unit, lowercase MeV or micro electron volt. And in other cases, it was 1,000,000 times that. And so people were saying, oh, these are light particles, and they had completely different interpretations of what a light particle was. I mean, these were particles, light particles to one half the room was 10 to the 12. That's a quadrillion times larger than the light particles in the other half of the room. So just calling something, you want to make sure that you have a definition for what the terms are that you're using. So what does high precision mean? And are we sure when we wrote this sentence that it's very high precision and not just regular high precision? Why not uber high precision? So adverbs are particularly bad at not really conveying useful information when it comes to the scientific literature. So if I were to rewrite the sentence original, using a Brown 2000 oscilloscope, the voltage was measured with very high precision. We measured the voltage to 4 significant figures using a Brown 2000 oscilloscope. Who is responsible for it? What did we measure? What does it, like, this is the precision. And then the reader can decide if that's high precision or low precision. So if we're talking about the spin of the electron, then 4 significant figures is really low precision. If we're talking about measuring some other parameter, then 4 significant figures could be a very large, very high precision. So that is discipline specific. And so by just writing it out, you don't have to decide what, how it should be, like what kind of taxonomy should be there. And then at the end, because only 2 people are going to care, what instrument you use to measure that voltage. So we measured the voltage to 4 significant figures using a Brown 2000 oscilloscope. Conveys the same information with a few exceptions. It's more precise, and there's responsibility for who made the measurement. This is one this used to be one paragraph. So these are the 3 sentences in one paragraph from a paper that will probably not see the light of day. It was written a long time ago by someone who's already graduated. But this was the text that was put on the page before. So this is pre going back through and re-editing everything. So this result can be used to inform observers of the optimum time to observe a system in order to diminish the ambiguity of RV signals near the 2-to-1 degeneracy. Data gathered near these key phrases will have more weight in determining the correct architecture than at any other phase. Coordinated observations at specific times should reduce the operation time and therefore costs, and nobody really cares what I'm reading right now because there's still text to go and I still don't understand what this is talking about. So this is the first draft. Rewriting this, once you have this written down on the page and you go back and you kind of apply some of those things that I mentioned before, this is where I would go from here. Our results identify the times when new observations will best distinguish between competing RV models for planets near the 2-to-1 degeneracy. The whole second sentence is useless. There's no new information in that second sentence. Observing at optimal times reduces both the operational costs and time required to correctly infer the orbital properties of the planets in relevant systems. So these 2 things, these 2 final sentences convey actually more information than what was in the original 3, and it uses only about half the words. So there's almost 80 words in the first 3 sentences, and there's just over 40 words in the last 2 sentences. And so by going back through and identifying what's the point of this sentence, what's the point of this paragraph, what am I trying to say in it, and then by eliminating passive voice, eliminating unnecessary adjectives and adverbs, you can cut your prose down by a significant amount, and it becomes a lot more clear what you're trying to say because there aren't any extra words in your prose. Okay, I'll try to wrap things up kind of quickly for the last part. A few things. So this is about just the writing itself. My recommendation, like the way that I write things, is I pick the portion of the paper that I want to write the most. Like, what is the most interesting thing for me to write? And I just put text on the page. You can't edit an empty page, and your first draft will not be your final draft. So I just put text on the page, write things down, flow of consciousness through it. And then in the editing process, I'll go back and implement those writing tips, or like the, using active voice and stuff like that. When I'm writing it down, I don't pay that much attention. Maybe I've gotten more used to it in 20 years, but I don't pay that much attention to what's the voice that I'm using. It's just getting the information out on the page in the order that I want to write it, or at least in the order that it comes to me. And then the editing process is where it turns into my actual writing. So the previous example was a good first try at getting information on the page. We didn't totally know what we were trying to go for, so we just wrote things down as it came to mind, trying to get complete sentences, and then going back. It took me like 2 minutes to rewrite, well, probably closer to 5 minutes to rewrite that paragraph in a way that was a lot tighter, but I wouldn't have been able to edit it if I didn't have anything on the page to begin with. So you can't edit an empty page, so get words on the page, then you can start building around that. Another thing is, a lot of times goals are really lofty. So this is the Spanish steps. There's like 8,000 steps to get up to the top of this staircase. Goals might be really lofty. It might be a long paper that you're working on. And so, and a lot of it might not be that interesting to write. So I typically, when I get in difficult situations where I'm not actually all that thrilled about writing, when the going gets tough, I set smaller goals for myself. So for example, I will say, I will write 1 paragraph before I eat lunch. I will write 1 sentence before I eat lunch. I'll write 250 words by the end of the day, maybe 100 words or something like that. So I set smaller goals for myself, because then I can be like, okay, I did that. Now I can go do something else, take a nap, come back, and the smaller the goals that I set for myself, the better it works for me. I have had days where I've written, a couple thousand words, and I get burned out by the end of the day. And so I generally will be like, I can write a paragraph before lunch. I can write a paragraph after lunch, and 2 paragraphs a day. If I write 2 paragraphs a day, then that gets me further down the road than if I sit there fretting about it and write 0 paragraphs a day. I also don't usually delete anything that I write until I'm going through the revision process. So even if I won't usually put text on a page and then delete it and then start something else, unless I know exactly what it is that I'm going to do. Like, oh, this is actually what I need to write. Okay, I'm going to start over and then I'm going to rewrite it. But I won't finish a paragraph and be like, okay, I don't really like that, and then start over and then think about, okay, what should I I usually am more of get stuff on the page and then I can always cut it down later. If you think of it, a typical article will be between 5,000 and 10,000 words. And so if you write 250 words a day, then it'll take 3 to 6 weeks to get everything out. So every little bit helps. So when the going gets tough and you don't want to write something or you're kind of stuck on something, set smaller goals. I'll write 1 paragraph today, 2 sentences before lunch, 2 sentences after lunch, whatever. That will get you through your paper, I think, faster than worrying about it. Often shorter articles take longer to write. So there's this one sentence, this is one of the pages or one of the paragraphs from a paper that I wrote a long time ago. This had a page limit of 4 pages, including references. And this one sentence that's circled here was about 2 weeks of work to get that one sentence. Sometimes short articles, how you cut it down, take longer to write. It actually turns into better writing. I prefer this format. But not everything that you did needs to make it into the literature. Sometimes it can just be your own personal thing to grow on. So cut down, keep everything as streamlined as you can make it. Let's see. Another thing that I always ask myself is, why is someone reading this paragraph? Why is someone reading this sentence? Why is someone reading this section? Why do these things exist? Because it will make it easier to read. It will help the audience work through your paper if they know why they're reading something and they don't have to figure it out as they go. Finally, this is like a second order thing. You can use, this is like the last bit of advice that I have when you're crafting, like you've written everything down, you followed those rules, and now you're going to go back and you're going to do your 3rd revision and you're going to start cleaning it up so that it's a little bit easier to read. So I will often write my first draft that's almost as much as possible in first person. So we did the analysis, we see the trend from this analysis, we show the result from the trend. And then in my second time through, especially if I'm just trying to get stuff out on the page, sometimes I'll catch it in the first draft, but in the second draft, that's when I'm going to start reordering what the subjects are in order to smooth out the language a bit. But that's a second order thing. It's not what I focus on the first draft. It's something that I'll come back on a later draft and say, okay, how can I make it so that the text isn't causing the person to jump all over the place? So if you do like, we did this, then we did that, then we did this, that's kind of the first grade, see Dick run, see Jane run kind of thing. One of the ways that you can kind of stitch together to make your prose flow more smoothly from one to the other is to use the object of one sentence as the subject of the next sentence. So we did an analysis, the analysis showed a trend, the trend implies this result. And that kind of can tie things together so that the person reading it, the logic is easy to follow. They don't have to keep kind of starting over. So this is what I will typically do on the third or fourth revision of a paper. Text on the page, clean up all the thoughts, like get the paragraphs the way that I want them to be, then clean up all the language, and then I will go and make it so that it's a little bit easier to read by, in this case, rearranging the sentences so that the pieces are easy to follow. They have a logical place. If I have a sentence that has 5 or 6 commas in it, like how can I rewrite the sentence so that I only need 2 commas? That's what I'll do kind of at the last of my writing. So anyways, that's basically all that I have for you, kind of a brain dump of the lessons that I've learned over the last several years. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have for the next several minutes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Steffen. It looks like we do have a question in the chat from a little earlier. They ask if future work should be discussed in the discussion or conclusion section. Mm-hmm.
So I answered that a little bit earlier, and I said it didn't really matter, in my opinion. It kind of depends on where it lands in, like how each discipline handles it. And I suspect that for my work, that usually happens in the discussion portion. Unless it's something that I specifically anticipate doing, I'll put it in the discussion section. If it is something that's going to follow on, then I might put it in the conclusion section. I'd have to really think about which one I would choose. I will say one other thing is that I always encourage people not to commit themselves to something. So will remove from my papers anything that says in our next paper, we will do this, because there are many times where people commit themselves to doing something that doesn't actually get done. And so rather than embarrassing myself by promising something that I won't deliver on, I just say, future work could show this, and then I'll start working on that future work on my own without committing myself to it.
Great, thank you.
So hopefully you found this information interesting and useful.
Looks like we don't have any more questions, but before we log off, we just want to thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise with us today. We really appreciate the insightful presentation, and thanks to all our participants for joining us to learn more about today's topic. But I hope everyone has a great rest of your day.
All right. Thank you. I appreciate it.